So yeah, we talked about on a previous episode around like abstinence from alcohol, but abstinence in general is a topic that's come up a lot. We had Ian Koniak who talked about porn addiction, which is actually the most downloaded episode we've had on the Cosmic Bridge. So I think it's obviously something people are struggling with. And what was interesting about that episode was that it wasn't one on social media that lots of people were liking, but like in the background, lots of people were downloading it. So it was obviously, I think, something people are struggling with in silence. But, not just porn. I think often with foods, there's like lots of different types of, like, we talked about micro stresses with Christine Armstrong, but I think we all have some type of micro addiction. So yeah, I don't know where do we want to start this, because we could talk about lots of different types of abstinence. But Tom, where do you think we should start this? Well,
episode? We talked about the most popular and downloaded episode, so porn does seem the best place to start.
Go for
it. We're talking about abstinence, but I think when it comes to porn, it's very misunderstood. And I don't want to sit here from a place of preaching or anything. I've watched porn religiously for every day, basically, from the age of 13 to 30. And just without any real knowledge or understanding of it. And you get into the science of it, but also just on a higher emotional level, it makes sense. The way it corrodes your brain into objectifying women. It corrodes your kind of energy levels, because we all know when we ejaculate, especially when it's not in some form of like loving context, it decreases our energy. It means we're staying at home staring at a computer screen, and maybe instead of trying to go out and date or meet a partner. And I think there's a website, Your Brain on Porn, and there's some crazy data behind it. And really, it does a huge amount of harm spiritually, emotionally, energetically, and so much more. And it's not understood. It's not talked about. I think it's the biggest addiction of this 21st century. And I've said many times, one of the best things I ever did was stopping drinking, but arguably the other best thing I ever did was stop watching porn. And that was, I don't know how long ago, a long time ago. And I'll never watch it again. My relationship's better. Well, I didn't have a relationship at the time, but now my relationship's incredible. My wife's in the studio here, so just truly magical. My energy levels are better. My general emotional well-being, how I look at women is different than ever before, and it's something that's not talked about, and it should be. What's your experience?
Yeah, I think the same. I think it was, growing up, it was just one of those things. I think we were in a weird age group. So Tom and I are the same age of 33, 34, where we grew up in a world without the internet. But then it was like when we were in our teenage years, the internet was coming up. And I guess that's obviously when you're becoming more like sexually active, whatever, and your hormones are strong. So I just feel like these sites were suddenly on the internet. And before, obviously, you'd probably have to go down the local newsagent and pay £5 for a magazine or whatever it was. So I think it just became very normalized in our generation. This is just something you would do almost on a daily basis, right? But I think we talked about in the alcohol episode, like, things are changing with a lot of young people don't drink as much as like our generation. But I think I don't know any data, maybe you have it, I imagine with younger people now who say are 15, 16, it's the same as us. I imagine it's just normal, and if not, maybe it's worse because of like screens and stuff. But do you have any data points around that?
I have no data. I come to the same assumption that you have.
But maybe we can go into, like, I managed to change my habit. I'm in a very loving relationship at the moment, and I think I don't know if that would have happened if I hadn't like stopped watching porn. But one of the things that comes from the porn thing, and I think a good thing that helps, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of people listening to this based on how popular the Ian Koniak episode was, that do have some form of porn addiction, right? So if you are looking at porn addiction, is thinking about this thing, semen retention, which actually like you introduced me to. So maybe like we can talk about that and I can give my own view on it as well.
Yeah. I think, semen retention in itself is not ejaculating even during sex, masturbation, or obviously, you know, if you're following that path, you're probably not going to be watching porn, but it comes from Eastern philosophy, sort of Japanese. There's a phenomenal book on it called The Tao of Sex and Loving, I think is what it's called. And it comes from semen as your seed of life, your energy center. And the more you're maintaining and growing and giving to that, the more your energy center grows, and the more you're ejaculating and releasing your seed, the less powerful your seed and the less powerful your energy is going to be. So that's where it comes from. And then when you go into the sexual practices, you maintain that energy. And we mentioned abstinence and at the start, and people are saying, well, I enjoy this or I enjoy that. Why do I want to give it up? Again, I just like we talked about in the alcohol episode, I didn't see this as giving anything up.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe you're giving up a 5-second dopamine, like boom, hit here. So sure, there's that. But then the energy you get afterwards that sustains so much longer, both during the event and afterwards, is phenomenal. And if people are wanting to look more into this, especially the porn, I mean, it doesn't find much to get the data on how that may be negatively influencing you that you're not even aware about. Just a quick Google will find it. But to go into the deeper topics, what's your experience?
Yeah, I thought I could talk around like because actually with this, the attitude you have towards sex is going to change. Whether you're in a relationship or whether it's one night stand, whatever it is, your attitude is totally going to change. Because I think if you go in with, I'm just trying to like ejaculate, right? Often that's quite a selfish thing from a man, and then obviously the woman's not going to enjoy that as much. Whereas if you're going with the process, I don't even want to ejaculate, obviously that's good for the woman, right? Because from a literal perspective, it's going to last much longer. But also, as soon as you release, you've like released your energy. So even if stuff is happening after that, you don't have that energy. So as you said in like Chinese, Japanese philosophy, like in Taoism, which is what you're talking about in that book, it's like your semen is your chi, which is like your life force, which if you think about it, you can't deny that, because that is literally what gives life, right, to other humans. So actually you're gonna, even if you're like in a relationship, if you go through this process, and it's not, I think they talk about this in the book, because Tom gave me this book, and they talk around, it's not saying, you know, never ejaculate at all, but it's just controlling it. And I think they also talk around, as you get older, the amount of times you can ejaculate is less, because I think the most sexually active, or like the most chi you have in your life is actually like when you're like 18 as a man. And then interestingly, as a woman, I think it's more around like 30, 35. So if you're a man, like when you're younger, you can ejaculate more, but as you start getting older, and I notice this once you're like 30, 40, 50, you have to be more controlled because your energy levels are going to be low. And if we take this outside of the context of sex, with your work, it's like you have more energy. There's, as you said, this is a bit of a taboo topic. A lot of people don't talk about it, but there are a lot of entrepreneurs, and they say their superpower is like semen retention, because they've got energy all the time, versus when they, you know, didn't do semen retention, they had a lot less energy. Yeah,
it's completely that. And, you know, I think we all know somebody around us who, you know, maybe it's a sex addiction, or maybe it's, you know, as we talked about in others, and Ian Koniak's episode with, you know, more the massage parlors, for example. I mean, maybe that, you know, it's also think about the energy behind how many of those, and it happens with both sexes, you know. I think we often focus on the male, you know, being the one who watches the porn, and the female, you know, but it's actually the female porn watching and female to male prostitution is also on the rise as well. So it's thinking about the energy behind that, and many of the people, if it's an empowered choice that's benefiting somebody when they're in that industry, fantastic. But I suspect in most cases there's very little power in that choice. It's come about through circumstance, and is that a circumstance you really want to be supporting? I mean, we're filming this in mid-July, and there's quite a big BBC scandal that I saw going on at the minute. We don't need to touch on that, but, you know, it's just quite topical that we're having this discussion today.
Yeah, it's very, very true. It's related to this topic. And I thought I'd tell a funny story, which is that when I first heard about this topic, I heard about it from two people. One was Tom, who was kind of telling me he got in this loving relationship through it, and was very happy. But then another one of my friends had got into it, but he was actually having more sex with loads of different women than he'd ever had. He's now in like a loving relationship. It was funny, the two sides, because it was like, and I think there's a movement online, again, you can Google it, called NoFap.
Yeah.
And that's a little less around, you can love, your one woman in a monogamous relationship, and more like women are super attracted to you everywhere you go. But it's true, because you've got more of that life energy force that you can give to anyone. As I said, it can be in your work, it can be in your life. But it was quite funny that I had those. It was the same thing. It was an energy that you're giving to one person, but my friend was giving it to lots of different people. So.
Yeah. A friend of mine, one Pablo, is one who introduced me to this concept, and he talked exactly about that point about how it happened for your friends.
Yeah,
he's not the only one.
Yeah, I think he was having a great time. Yeah, and I remember another person who brought this up, actually. He didn't call it semen retention, but I listened to Stephen Bartlett's podcast, and he had a British Zimbabwean girl on, I've forgotten her name now, and she was talking around how she was a bit of a sex addict, actually, and she was talking about sex as very like transactional to her, and even some of the things she was doing, and it was like transactional to the man as well, so he was just trying to finish, and then eventually now she has more, loving. And Stephen Bartlett was then giving his perspective, which was that he was very selfish and very childish in a way, which is like, oh, it's just like, how quickly can I finish? And it's more of like a game of like racking it up. So as you said, obviously we talked about, porn objectifying women, but I think even like if you do semen retention, and again, like I said, I'm not saying like never ever ejaculate, but I'm saying you don't have to do it every time. And if you go in with that process of like, I'm just going in to enjoy the moment versus ejaculate, it can have a really transformational experience.
Yeah. And I would say for anyone like who is a bit skeptical, just give it a go, try it, just 2 weeks, and see how your energy levels feel. Yeah. And I promise you will feel, if you do it properly and you're living a decent life and eating healthily and all of that as well, I promise you'll feel a noticeable effect.
Yeah, 100%. That's how I started. I think I did it for like a few weeks, and I was like, wow, I have a lot of energy. This is pretty crazy. I know we've said I think we've just gone maybe talk for like 15 minutes just on porn addiction and semen retention, but maybe we talk about fasting as well. So I know, I think I grew up Catholic, have my mum's Irish, my dad's Welsh, and I've always been a believer. I wouldn't say I'm religious. I don't go to church every Sunday, but I have faith. And so I've always been into fasting from, I guess, during Lent, Christians fast for 6 weeks. We don't even really fast. I think it's a bit of a cop-out. We like give up chocolate or bread or whatever it is versus, Muslims in Ramadan who are like properly fasting. But I think after I gave up alcohol, I then got quite curious about fasting. I had a Muslim friend, and I did Ramadan with him for 24 hours, and that was my first fast. And I think there's a lot of health benefits to it around like lowering diabetes and insulin and all this stuff. So that's one thing, but then there's definitely more of like a spiritual effect to it, because I guess if you're eating, you're like getting lower into the ground in a way, whereas if you're not eating, you're like a bit more up there in the clouds. But yeah, I know you've been through this process. I think Tom and I were talking about this earlier. The longest fast that I've done is 36 hours. I think you've done what was the longest fast you did? I
did one for 100 hours.
Wow.
So just over 4 days, just water. I haven't done that, compared to some of the people I know. I think I met somebody who had done a 21-day water fast, and I was actually watching a documentary on Gaia the other day. Gaia's sort of spiritual Netflix, or just on fasting, and it went through all the benefits: psychological, physical, emotional. Somebody did a 41-day for under medical control. Wow. Definitely don't do that, Len.
Don't do that. We don't want to be responsible for death. So.
Yeah, we're not medical advice and all of that. But anyway, food's one of, again, talking about addictions, one of the biggest addictions we've had, especially when, the simple carbohydrates and sugars and processed foods, how amazing they are. And actually, it kind of keeps our brain, especially sugar, wired, and simple basic carbohydrates convert into sugars and do the same. And when you have you know, when you do leave that, you do become into sort of altered states, and you do raise your energy levels sometimes, because digestion's an incredibly energy intensive process. Now, not always, obviously you feel lows during that as well, but yeah, it's also just a powerful sort of mind control. Who runs the show here? Is it my mind just saying, I want to eat, I'm hungry, or is it actually, I really don't need to eat? You know, you can fast for long periods of time, and it's a great challenge. It can help you change how you're feeling, change your health, transform things, and it's another thing that obviously get the right advice and help before doing it, but I really do advise looking more into.
Yeah, interesting what you're saying. And I thought that when I fasted, which is, it seems counterintuitive that you can have more energy from fasting. Yeah. And then, like you said, your gut is obviously especially if you eat too much. We've all eaten too much. I've often done this when I'm working in the afternoon, and then you have a massive lunch and suddenly you're lagging and you've got to have a coffee or a tea or whatever it is. And one, there's that gut process. But two, it's like you said, it's that thing of, because I guess it's one less thing to worry about. You don't even think, oh, what am I going to eat for lunch? What am I going to eat for breakfast, right? It's that.
Well, it's that whole, like, I think it's Mark Zuckerberg wears the same clothes every day. I mean, he has different pairs so they're clean, but it's just so he doesn't have to think and just can focus on what he really wants to do. Now, obviously, food's a lot different. It's a basic necessity of life. But interestingly, in that documentary, there was a religious group who fasted for 24 hours every month, and the money they would have spent on food, they donate to feeding the homeless, and they spend a day going around feeding the homeless. And I think that's just a really good way to connect with not just doing it from a purely selfish point of view or to benefit your health. Sure, do that too, but actually really transform it into a full cycle of how it's benefiting everyone.
I really like that. Yeah, so all that money you would have spent on food, you can give.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you won't know, but I think it was a group of Mormons in Salt Lake City. It was on that Gaia documentary called Fasting. But
wow, yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I was thinking with what we're talking about with abstinence, because I think a lot of abstinence is what I call like voluntary suffering, because it's like, even we're talking about, there's a lot of health benefits to fasting, etc. But there are going to be points in your day where you are like really hungry, right? And you do want to eat. And sometimes from a spiritual perspective, and going into what you're saying with almost like charity work, I do think in those situations, I think, wow, I'm actually very fortunate, because there's a lot of people in many parts of the world, even, you know, some people here, they're going through that like on a daily basis. So one, it like gives you empathy with them, but two, it's that voluntary suffering. And then Mark Zuckerberg is someone who I'm generally not a massive fan of. Obviously, we talked around. It's weird because we're talking about him in a positive aspect here. We talked around like, you know, social media addiction, whatever. Whether those things blew out of control without him, who knows? But what was interesting is I was listening to a podcast with him the other day with Lex Friedman, and he was talking about, he does like martial arts. There's this thing people have probably seen online that him and Elon Musk are apparently going to do like a jiu-jitsu fight or something, which I'm sure again is actually just to get attention for themselves. But one of the things Lex Friedman said to him, because he does competitions just with random people, not with celebrities. And he's like, you know, a lot of people know who you are. You're not worried you're going to get embarrassed. And he was like, at this point, I've been embarrassed so many times in my life, right? So he's like, been in front of Congress and all these things. And I thought it was interesting because I had more respect for him after that, because I thought it goes into this thing of like the voluntary suffering. And the thing he said, he's like, the more times you get embarrassed in your life, probably the more you're going to be successful. And I've often thought about it with failure, like failing. So in my role of sales, like we were talking about before, you get rejected loads of times whenever you want something. But often I do feel like I worry about getting embarrassed about things. And I think really to be successful in life, because if you ever take up something for the first time, you're always going to be embarrassed, right? Yeah. Because you're naturally going to be like stupid at it. So again, it may be that thing, let's say with fasting, where it's, oh, I don't want to fast because what if I fail, right? What if after like 4 hours I get hungry?
Yeah. Yeah, and again, you know, for bring it back to as well, it's, you know, failing, but the actual, forget the failing or the abstinence side, the benefits that it does bring you. And in a way, you're, you know, obviously if you're doing it all all year round, then yeah, maybe you are going to lose out. But there are times where you can fast and bring yourself huge benefits emotionally, physically, health-wise, and you're only adding to your life. So yeah, maybe start small. Maybe start with intermittent fasting, 16 hours, 18 hours a day, and then eat for the 8 or the 6 hours. But there are many different ways to do it. And, even if it is, you mentioned maybe Christianity is a bit of a cop-out during Lent, but still, even giving up chocolate.
Giving up one thing. Yeah, 100%. And it's funny, actually, we were thinking the same thing at the same time, because I was going to say that, which is like, a 24-hour fast, maybe quite a lot to some people. Whereas, do the skip breakfast, right? Like eat at 12 p.m. And it's not the skip breakfast because you got up too late and you're hungover and you don't have time to make breakfast. It's the when I said voluntary suffering, the voluntary part is totally important, because it's like if you suffer voluntary versus involuntary, it's totally like a psychological shift. So it's important you do that. And it's like we've been talking about this a lot on these different episodes. There's like set small steps. So set a step of I'm going to fast for 16 hours if that goes well, 20 hours if that goes well, 24, and then it can be more. And it's like we talked about with alcohol, do 6 weeks to start, 3 months, etc. You've always got to do the baby steps. And I think in the other episode where we talked about visualization and manifestation, that's what we said. Often people don't want to take those small steps to start, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah. And even if you do feel up for, in most cases, that will always be the philosophy I go with. But interestingly, with fasting, the 100-hour fast I went straight into, I committed to 48 hours and just kept going. And then, by 100, I needed to eat something. But I think that was my second big fast. My first one, I committed to a 5-day juice fast and extended it to 7. So I don't know, maybe I'm a bit weird with this, but yeah, on the whole, I do completely agree. Those smaller steps will win in the end.
Yeah. Why do you, I guess question I have for you, because we talked today around like, with the alcohol thing from one day to the next, we're just like, I'm giving it up. And even like your ayahuasca journey, you took it once, on this journey to like becoming a shaman. What do you think it is about like I guess you could call it will. I guess is a way you look at it. You could call it like very strong willpower, which is great. You could call it around like going very deep on something. What do you think it is about your personality that's like
I enjoy it. I mean, there's positives and negatives to anything, as we know, and there's never one right way, sure. But I just enjoy pushing things to limits and just experiencing things that maybe most people will never experience in their lives. I think it's not to say it's always fun, but and when you can experience that, I think you can more connect to other people, more connect to God, more connect to energy, more connect to like that vitality force. And you can, I think when you go to those levels, you also open up a space that allows you to empathize and help more people in it. So I don't know what it is, I don't know why, but I love it.
Good stuff. Well, yeah, I'm going to give 2 very simple takeaways from this episode. Stop wanking so much and stop eating so much.
Love it.
And if someone is wanking or eating too much in their life, share the episode with them, and subscribe to us on YouTube podcast as always. Hope you found this episode fun, and we'll see you next time.